Welcome to DC Close-Up. I'm Lesley-Ann Morgan, Global Head of DC and L&G's asset management business. This episode comes to you from our Hong Kong office. I'm joined by Natasha Mora, who leads our asset management business across Asia. We've been spending time with pension plans and wealth providers in Australia and Hong Kong, and it's clear there are strong parallels with the UK, alongside valuable insights that we can all learn from. Natasha, welcome to DC Close-Up.
Thank you. It's great to have you here in the Hong Kong office.
Shall we start with Australia, Natasha? Because I think there's quite a few lessons that the UK can learn from Australia. The Australian DC system is huge. It's 4.5 trillion Australian dollars. That's 1.5 times their GDP. And they really have been going through this whole scale story that we've been seeing in the UK. So I kind of think about there's three things in Australia that the UK can learn from. First is the scale and the consolidation. The second is the impact of the performance test, which is quite similar to the way in which we're going to have a performance test or a value for money test in the UK. And the final thing is around decumulation. So what are they doing about retirement and who's winning in retirement? Shall we start then with that area about scale and consolidation? What's been going on and what do you think the UK can learn from that?
It's true, there has been a lot of consolidation in the Australian market. So if I think back 10 years ago, there were over 200 superannuation schemes. There are now less than 100 and they're still consolidating. The top 24 large funds control over 95% of all assets now. And the performance test, which you've mentioned, and which we're going to come on to, has played a really big part in that consolidation. But so has the regulator, who's encouraged some funds to merge.
So I guess there has been consolidation, but probably not as much as we're going to get in the UK, because the scale test that's being brought in the UK may result in maybe less than 10 master trusts. So even though it's gone from 200 to about 100 in Australia, that's still not the same level of consolidation that we're probably going to see in the UK.
And I think the important thing to remember is that in Australia, in addition to those superannuation schemes, you also have a large number of what we call self-managed superannuation schemes. And this is where the members are the trustees of their own scheme. The people run the fund themselves, and they make all the investment decisions, the compliance decisions, rather than leaving it to a large industry or retail fund. It's estimated that there are now over 600,000 of these self-managed schemes, and therefore this is possibly not quite the consolidation that was hoped for at a total system level.
No, I mean, that's incredible. Can we come on to talk about this performance test? Because I was really struck when we were in Australia about the impact of the performance test and what resonance that might have in a UK context for the value for money.
Yeah. So the performance test came in Australia for the default fund in July 2021. And in Australia, that's called Your Future, Your Super. And it differs a little bit from what's been suggested for the UK. Basically, each superannuation fund sets their strategic asset allocation. And the performance test is applied primarily at an asset class level and relative to a public market benchmark or benchmarks.
Okay.
There have been a few challenges with that, and subsequent versions or iterations of the performance test have attempted to tweak that. The key point is that what we've seen is a hugging of the index, and it has become more challenging for the superannuation funds to invest, particularly in private assets, with the exception of infrastructure. I'm really interested to know, what do you think that might mean by way of learnings for the UK in terms of value for money?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in this real dichotomy in the UK. where there's been a huge amount of market pressure to reduce the fees that are being paid by employers for master trusts. But simultaneously, the government is also trying to get the amount of private assets, particularly the amount of private assets in the UK, increased. So we've got this real conundrum, if you will. I thought it was interesting when we were in Australia that one of the ways round this that they were thinking of was that they would essentially create some sort of side pocket, yes, which would allow the superannuation schemes to invest in venture capital, renewable energy and social housing. So maybe that's something that might come to the UK in future.
Shall we move on to point 3 that you mentioned at the start and around innovation in retirement products in Australia? I heard you say that despite the retirement income covenant that came in July 2022 for trustees of superannuation funds, which requires those trustees to formulate and publish a retirement income strategy for their members, you actually haven't seen as much innovation as you might have expected.
Exactly right. I've actually been really surprised by how little innovation there's been in Australia, given that even before the retirement income covenant, there was something called SIPPers, which was also designed to be a sort of retirement product. We've seen a couple of providers provide something that looks a bit like CDC in the UK, but there really hasn't been that much innovation. Most are kind of in some sort of drawdown product. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that idea of targeted support that we have in the UK is just not permitted in Australia, because that would be regarded as advice. So any way in which they think they might be able to help people always comes down to advice. And so there's always that fear that they might be overstepping the line. I think the other area is really that concern by the trustee of not knowing enough about the member to be able to give them a solution that works for them. So there's a number of different barriers, if you will, that's been kind of getting in the way of being able to design proper retirement solutions in Australia. But who do you think is winning in retirement in Australia, Natasha, if it's not the supers?
I think it's really interesting here. I think it's actually the advisors supported by the technology platforms who are actually seeing the most growth in this area. The tech platforms are making life really easy for the advisors by enabling straightforward portfolio construction, compliance, reporting. And there are a huge number of investment and insurance products that provide great choice.
Right.
And so the superannuation schemes are finding it really hard to retain members at the point that they get to retirement.
Yeah. And my sense was that really the fees that are getting paid once someone gets outside of the superannuation scheme are actually not that different to the ones being paid inside superannuation. Yeah. So that barrier that maybe we might have in the UK is really not there in Australia. So I guess it's not a surprise that you see a lot of people leaving their supers when they've been in them for many, many years and going off to these wealth platforms. So I think that whole performance test area that's in Australia really makes us think a lot about Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has got into a very interesting space in terms of how important performance and fees have become here. The mandatory provident fund system, which is similar to master trusts in the UK, is significant. It's not as big as Australia by any mean feat, but it does have assets of about 1.4 trillion Hong Kong, which is about 130 billion pounds. And it is a core part of retirement savings for the population here. And it's been going through this meaningful evolution, particularly in relation to EMPF. What's your take on some of these changes that have been happening here, Natasha?
Indeed. I think EMPF is having a really significant impact on MPF providers here in Hong Kong. So the EMPF rollout is now complete. And what that's done is it's centralized administration across the system. And what that really means for your MPF providers is it's becoming really difficult to differentiate.
Right.
You can't differentiate anymore on the member experience because they no longer hold the member data.
Right.
So now the focus has shifted much more to fees and investment performance.
Right. Okay. And at the moment, like in the UK, the employer selects the MPF provider.
Correct.
But the intention is in the next few years that there will be what's called full portability here. So that means that individuals, once they're inside an MPF provider, will actually then be able to choose their own MPF provider, perhaps be able to switch a couple of times a year. So my sense of that is it's going to create a much more competitive retail-like DC market.
Exactly. I think, therefore, what we're expecting to see is much greater use of passive building blocks to manage costs.
Yeah.
A quicker turnover by MPF providers of the underlying managers where performance has been poor.
Yeah.
And a greater use of multi-manager kind of white labeled options that allow an easier switch out of poorer
underlying managers.
Right. Correct.
Right. So that's accumulation. But what about decumulation? Because decumulation looks completely different here in Hong Kong to Australia and the UK. What can we tell people about kind of how it actually works here and what happens?
It is really different. So at the point of retirement, a member is written a physical check by the MPF provider and will often take that to the bank and cash it.
Wow. Okay.
There's no tax paid on the MPF account, so it's a straightforward exercise to pay out the whole account in this way. MPF providers and the regulators would very much like to see members stay invested in the MPF.
Right.
But in reality, this is proving quite difficult to achieve. And I think that's partly because MPF wasn't originally designed to think about people in retirement versus the accumulation phase.
No, right, okay. So I guess from a cultural perspective here as well, we've heard from a few people that people like to be able to invest their own money. So that concept of being able to invest for themselves is something that's very appealing.
It is. Many believe that they are able to manage their assets in retirement. For some, they may engage an advisor or an insurance agent to help advise them. Here, different to the UK, I understand, many agents and advisors do not charge a fee.
Okay.
So instead, they're paid a commission.
Okay.
And this means individuals may be invested across a whole wide range of different products in retirement.
So completely different to what we've seen in the other two markets. Interesting. So thank you, Natasha. That's been a really interesting perspective, and that global picture hopefully will help our UK audience. Thanks again.
Thank you.
To me, Australia brings into focus the real decisions trustees and pension providers face in a mature DC market. Managing assets at scale in a system that can penalise holding assets that are not in the index, dealing with complex regulation, particularly around advice, while navigating the path towards better retirement outcomes. Hong Kong, on the other hand, shows how shifting administration to the government sharpens members' focus on performance and fees during accumulation. With full portability on the way, we're likely to see more movement between MPF providers. And because people can cash out at retirement, the focus naturally shifts to real engagement and a smoother handoff into wealth. Now, Australia, Hong Kong and the UK are physically miles apart, but the questions DC is trying to answer are increasingly the same. How do we turn savings into sustainable income? How do we design defaults that do more of the heavy lifting? And how do we support people to make good decisions when it matters most? Natasha, thank you very much for joining me today. And thank you to everyone for watching. I hope that you found today's insight valuable. See you again soon.